All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Chase Iflin. I'm the Minister of Community and Connection at Redemption Church, and I want to invite you to, or welcome you, I guess, to our first ever City Conversations event. If you are not familiar with us as a church, we're a church that is wandering and moving towards a permanent home. So we have been meeting at Cheyenne Middle School for the past 5 years, and tomorrow morning we'll meet in this room for the first time. And then later this year, we'll move into our permanent building in downtown Edmond. We're looking very much forward to that. These events that we've called City Conversations are what we want to be a gift to our city. We want to have these regularly as just an opportunity for people from our city to gather to have conversations about what it looks like to flourish in Edmond and in the world, and just conversations that are accessible to a wide range of people. And so you guys are here at the very first one, so thank you for that. Just a couple logistics. Hopefully you saw the coffee and snacks on your way in. Those will be out there all morning, so feel free to grab those at any point. The restrooms are right across from the coffee, so if you find the coffee, just right across the hall are restrooms. We will have 2 sessions with our speaker, Dr. Noble. In the middle of those sessions, we'll have a break, so you can grab coffee, grab snacks, use the restroom, and then we'll have a third session, which will be a question and answer with Dr. Noble and with our lead pastor, Jeff Lawrence. For that question and answer, you can text in questions for that at any point this morning. So there should be a phone number up here on the screen. You just need to text your question to that phone number. It's that simple. You can do that at any point in the morning. We'll have that phone number up during the break, so if you don't have a chance to get it down now, you can get it then. And I think that's it. Welcome. Jeff, why don't you come up here?
Thank you, Chase. Hey, thank you all for being here. We're excited just to get this conversation started and continue to lean in here. I want to just set up kind of some expectations or talk about why we're doing these things called City Conversations. Part of the heart behind this, when we started the church about 9 years ago, our church started, part of the heart when we began thinking about the church was just thinking about creating a space where all kinds of people would feel welcome to come in and ask questions and begin to have dialogue about things. So doubters and skeptics and those who maybe were antagonistic even to the Christian faith could come alongside people who had a deep and thriving faith and be able to just enter into conversations together. And frankly, I had that experience when I was in college. I actually worked for several years in the kind of high-tech world of telecommunications, and I had the same experience where I got to have all kinds of conversations with people. I remember talking with Jerry Chin, and Jerry was a guy that went to lunch with and began to have a dialogue with him, and he literally laughed at me the first time I began to talk about my faith. It was like, man, someone tried to sell me that in college, and I didn't buy it then. I'm not buying now. But about 6 months later, Jerry showed up and said, hey, I just want to talk. And we just developed a friendship and just began to continue to have conversations. I remember a guy named Steve that after hours we used to play video games on the network at work because it was really fast. And he barged in my office one day when we were playing and just said, man, what faith are you? I need something. I don't know where to go. And so we just began to have these conversations. And Steve honestly cussed more than any human being I ever knew. But we just developed a friendship and had really good conversations along the way. Then there was Karen, who actually was my boss. And Karen was a staunch atheist, was a highly intelligent woman, a highly kind woman, and also was the best person I ever worked for, was the best boss I ever had. But as we had these conversations, she knew that I was studying Old Testament, and I'd found out that she had been on archaeological digs in Israel for 2 years, had done PhD work at the University of Michigan in anthropology. And so we began to have these intellectual conversations, and I'd just say, man, here's what I'm learning. Tell me about, you've been in Israel on digs, tell me about those experiences. And she began to joke that she was my resident pagan friend. And so we just began to have these conversations, and over the course of about 2 years, Karen actually went through some difficult personal times, and there came a time when she began to ask different questions. And in asking those different questions, it led to a long journey of my wife and I just befriending her and got to kind of point her in the direction of faith and seeing some amazing things that happened there. And then there were other stories that they don't all turn out that way, like JP, and JP was a guy from Lebanon, and we developed a good friendship, but his favorite thing to do to me, knowing I was a Christian, was he'd call me into his office and be like, hey, can you help me with something? And call me around his computer. And when I looked at his computer, he'd have pornography pulled up on his computer. And JP thought that was hilarious that he got the Christian to sin by looking at this thing that was on his screen. And so we had different conversations. But I enjoyed hearing about him growing up in Lebanon and in a war-torn time and all the things that he experienced. And those are the kinds of conversations I had when I was in the working world. When you become a pastor, it's harder to have those conversations. Because people hear you're a pastor, and instantly there's like this little bit of a distance that's created. And so we wanted to create a church that had those kinds of conversations. And so I don't tell you all those snippets just to tell you a story, tell you a bunch of stories, but I really want you to know that people can actually talk to one another and disagree. People can actually talk to one another and come from different points of view. People can actually have deep conversations with one another, and they can come from different places, and they can find common ground where they share some things. They can also find places where they disagree. But here's what I found in having those conversations with my friends personally, is I found out that I actually needed those conversations. That entering into those conversations with my friends actually strengthened my faith. It actually helped me to grow in ways that I didn't. It actually surfaced some of my own doubts, and looking at the questions that my friends were asking actually made me realize I have some of the same questions, and I need the Lord to reshape the way I'm thinking about these things and deepen my own understanding of the world that we live in and my understanding. And so having those conversations gave me empathy for my friends. It gave me understanding of the questions they were asking, but also stirred my heart to figure out what does this mean for me and what I believe. So our heartbeat in creating these is just the idea that when thoughtful people come together in humble and honest dialogue, that we can grow together and we can grow in understanding of one another and good things can happen. And so that's the heartbeat in doing this. And here's what I want you to know up front is as we try to create space for people, this is the first one of these we want to create. We want to continue to see these grow, and we want to invite people into those. We hope that you'll come back and invite some friends next time. But we may not do this perfectly. But here's what I do want you to know is that your questions are welcome here, that your doubts will be respected, and your disagreements are okay. So as you come and we may not see eye to eye, and you ask questions, those things are okay. And we want you to know this is a great place to ask questions. We want to be a space that isn't afraid of real conversations. And so we want to create those as best we can. So let me just say thank you for joining the conversation. We're glad that you're here. Let me introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Alan Noble, as he makes his way up here, has a PhD from Baylor University, my alma mater. We could do Sikkim and all that, but your hands are full, so we'll leave it alone for now. But Alan is an associate professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University. He's co-founder and editor-in-chief of Christ and Pulp Culture. He's an advisor for the AND campaign. He's written for The Atlantic, for Vox, BuzzFeed, Gospel Coalition, Christianity Today, and First Things. He's also the author of 3 books. His first was Disruptive Witness, which came out 4 years ago. Does that sound right? It's all a blur at this point. Came out about 4 years ago, and then a couple years ago, You Are Not Your Own came out. Most of our talks today are going to come from his book, You Are Not Your Own, and so you're going to hear a lot about that today. And he's got another one coming out in April, that is called On Getting Out of Bed, which maybe we'll get you to talk a little bit about that in the Q&A at the end or something like that. But super excited to have Dr. Noble here and grateful for his time, and let's give him a welcome as he comes and begins.
All right. Thank you for showing up on a Saturday morning. This is how I want to spend my Saturday morning. I hope this is how you want to spend yours because you're here. So it's too late. How is it possible? It's going to be we're going to have these 2 main sessions and then the Q&A. And the first one is going to be rough. We've got to get through some heavy things, but there's hope. So stick around. How is it possible to live in one of the most advanced, prosperous, and free nations in history, and yet sense that our lives are on some fundamental level not right? How is it possible to carry around historically unimaginable tools of communication in our pockets and live on a planet with 7.6 billion people and yet suffer from a crisis of loneliness? How is it possible to know more about the human mind neurologically, psychologically than at any other point in human history? A body of knowledge developed over centuries with hundreds of thousands of intricate peer-reviewed journal articles and studies and yet we have a growing mental health crisis. How is it possible to have perpetual high-quality, affordable access to nearly limitless sources of entertainment and yet feel terribly bored? How is it possible that each year we gain new systems, technologies, and services that allow us to be more efficient than ever, and yet our work seems to invade more and more spaces of our lives? We are not right. Now, I can give you plenty of examples of the deep disorder in our society, and we'll look in a minute about some of these, things like declining life expectancies, drug overdoses, mental health crises, and so on. But I want to put these on pause for a moment and talk about something else. Do you ever catch yourself saying something like, I just need to get through the day? Or maybe I just need to, in general, as in I just need to be more disciplined. And these phrases are always accompanied by a sense of inadequacy and helplessness, as if you know everything you need to do to live a good, fulfilling, satisfying, successful life, but you're even more aware that you can't do it. In a moment, we'll discuss how we cope with this feeling of helplessness and inadequacy, but for now, I just want to name it. Life feels unsustainable. We might even say that modern life does not seem to be designed for humans. Now, the first thing I'm going to argue is that the contemporary world, at least in the West, was not designed for humans, at least as God made us. All societies are formed with some conception of what it means to be a human person. And if you begin with a false conception, a false anthropology, you're going to build an alien environment, which sounds cool, but is actually not so nice. People will suffer, and they will suffer in a manner specific to being out of place. Now, I would like to talk about the Baylor Bears. Can we get these slides here? There we go. There we are. See? Yes. As Jeff said, I went to Baylor. When I was at Baylor, I was a grad student, got my PhD at Baylor, and we would go and visit these bears with our kids. It was nice to have a little mini zoo on campus to come take our little kids to see something. So we would come here and see Lady and Joy, only one of whom is still living, unfortunately, regularly. And when we did, we would always see the bears doing the same thing, pacing in circles. Pacing in circles. Now, let's see the next slide here. In 1945, Baylor first created their habitat for these bears. The story that I've read is that some college students got a bear. I don't know if it's a black or a brown bear. I don't know from bears. But had a bear, as college students are wont to do, and the campus confiscated it, because they're killjoys. And they put them in a cage. And as you can tell, this was not a very good habitat. It was mostly concrete, and there was a pool, but it was mostly just concrete. And then in 1976, if we could see the next slide, 77, we have an improved, doesn't really look improved, does it? A series of concrete steps. This is called the Bear Pit, and if you go to Baylor basketball games, the student section is still called the Bear Pit. So this was essentially a pit for bears. I don't know if I have another slide of this from the outside. Yeah, there it is from the outside. It looks like an above-ground swimming pool, but made of concrete. So an above-ground swimming pool and a prison combined. Not a great habitat. And then in 2004, they began a redesign, spent lots of money on a redesign. Listen to some of the ways they describe the intention behind this. They say the new habitat will enhance the bear's living environment and provide a home more like their natural habitat. So I want you to note that the intention was to create an environment that was like the natural habitat. Another quote: "The current bear's habitat was constructed in 2005 with the intention of a, quote, bear's dream world." I'm not sure how one would know what a bear's dream world is, but that's approximately it. A 2,000 square foot facility featuring 3 caves, a waterfall, 3 wading ponds, a night house, and more. It's rated for a Category 5 hurricane and is the safest place on campus. Unless you're a human and the bears are hungry, in which case it seems to me that it would not be a very safe place. Now, you know, I was a graduate student. We also had a waterfall because the bathtub on our second floor would leak into the first floor. But I was always envious of these bears because they had this beautiful environment that they lived in. They had much more of a lawn than we certainly did. And they had all kinds of fresh fruits and vegetables, which of course, and meats, you know, because they're bears, and things that graduate students struggled to afford. And yet, every time I went to visit these bears, they were doing the same exact thing. And you've seen this if you've been to a zoo. They were pacing in circles. And there was a little worn path on the ground where the grass had been worn down to the dirt, where they compulsively walked. This was a space that was designed for bears, quite intentionally, but it was not designed for bears as they actually are, because actual bears aren't meant to be kept in captivity. They're not the kind of creatures that can flourish in a cage. Now, I'm not going to argue that we are caged in a zoo, but I don't think it's wrong to say that we live in a habitat that is not designed for humans. We certainly share a kind of zoochosis. That's that pacing. That's what it's called, a zoochosis, a psychosis of captive animals, an anxious, tiring, bored, endless pacing, a weariness, a sense that we're trapped and out of place. And like the bears, we live in an environment that seems to be designed for us, seems to be designed for our flourishing, and yet it's not. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, I actually know quite a few people who live satisfying, flourishing lives. This doesn't sound anything like their daily experience, and yet I wonder if we take this seriously. Take their phones, their computers, their televisions, their podcasts and exercise classes and 80-hour work weeks away, their shopping sprees, their planners. Would they not start to feel the weight of their own existence constricting them, closing in on them? Would they not begin to worry, to feel an anxiety, a fear of missing out, of falling behind, of wasting away? Would not their conscience begin calling up memories of failures, doubts, and insecurities? Thankfully, the modern world is perfectly designed for people who are trying to avoid themselves, who are afraid of being alone with themselves. Smartphones, in that sense, were not designed against our will to be addictive. We want to be addicted to screens because the screen into another world is a lot safer than a mirror reflecting our own, even if it means diverting us with news of terrible things happening all over the globe. So, how many of those who seem to be living a very satisfying, fulfilling life are only able to get out of bed in the morning because of the momentum of life? How many of those who seem to be living fulfilling lives are merely filling their lives? Now, I don't doubt for a minute that many people live stimulating, pleasurable, comfortable lives, but so do many cats and dogs. And if humans are distinct from animals, and we are, then stimulation and pleasure and physical comfort are wholly inadequate measures of the good life. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that everyone is absolutely miserable all the time beneath the surface. But I do think that a lot of us are anxious, lonely, tired, bored, overwhelmed, and tired again. The motto for many contemporary people is, as I said earlier, I just need to get through the day. I just need to survive. And to cope, many of us self-medicate. If this sounds pessimistic, let's consider at least one or two trends in contemporary America. Among young people, there has been a dramatic increase in mental illness diagnoses. College campuses have been ground zero for these issues, but most schools have failed to keep up. In my experience as a professor, students who suffer from mental illnesses are not snowflakes. On the contrary, many times I've had to urge students to take advantage of the mental health services that schools provide because they prefer to keep their problems to themselves and suffer alone, even though their lives are falling apart. Young people are torn up over broken families, childhood abuse, anxiety, depression, loneliness, dread that they'll never amount to anything, imposter syndrome, choice paralysis, porn addictions, suicidal ideation, profound and extensive brokenness. One survey found that nearly 43% of undergraduates felt so depressed that it was difficult to function in the past year, and 64% said they felt overwhelming anxiety. Between these scholarly studies and my own personal experience in the classroom, I've come to assume that in any given classroom, there will be many students suffering from a diagnosed mental illness, others suffering from undiagnosed mental illnesses, some survivors of sexual abuse, and many who struggle with anxiety, depression, and aimlessness. Now, some of this, the increase in diagnoses can be ascribed to heightened awareness of mental health, which is a good thing, which is a positive thing, and decreased taboos. People are more comfortable talking about mental illnesses, but that's not the whole story. That can't explain all the numbers. Our kids are not all right, and frankly, the rest of us are not doing a whole lot better. According to the CDC, between 2011 and 2014, almost 13% of people aged over 12 took an antidepressant in the past month. There are wonderful uses of antidepressants, so don't hear me saying that. But the widespread use of psychiatric medications led one historian of psychiatry to remark in the New York Times, I believe, we've come to a place, at least in the West, where it seems that every other person is depressed and on medication. You have to wonder what that says about our culture. More alarming is the trend of the declining life expectancy in the United States. This is a historical anomaly. And in industrialized countries, life expectancy only goes one direction, up. People live longer and longer and longer. But prior to COVID, 2018, the CDC director released a statement saying, tragically, this troubling trend, which is a declining life expectancy, is driven largely by deaths from overdoses and suicides. The life expectancy of Americans started to decline before COVID, the first time since the Spanish flu. And it was driven, as the CDC director says, by what some call deaths of despair. A significant segment of American population finds life unbearable. Some cope with medications, some turn to opiates and suicide. In their carefully researched study of these deaths of despair, these two economists, Ann Case and Angus Denton, they wrote a book called Deaths of Despair, which is a fascinating and painful read, repeatedly point to the loss of meaning. The loss of meaning in American life is one of the drivers of these deaths of despair. The loss of fulfilling work, marriages, churches, and communities, which I find to be incredibly fascinating. The way we live together seems to be sick. Here are a couple other data points for us. The percentage of men who say they have no close friends, went from 3% in 1990 to 15% in 2021. According to the math, that's 5 times increase, I think. I teach English, I don't know from math. 3 to 15%. Living in a society governed by technique conditions us to believe that life is getting easier than ever. Technique is the use of rational methods to maximize efficiency, and we see it everywhere. time-saving technology, apps that maximize our workouts, medicines that drown out irrational thoughts, ubiquitous entertainment in our pockets, scientifically proven methods for parenting, buying a car, working out, eating, shopping, budgeting, folding clothes, sleeping, sex, dating, everything. The promise of technique is that we are collectively overcoming all of our problems through research, technology, and discipline. All you have to do is find the right self-help book, life hack, or life coach, or devotional. But it leads to some dehumanizing conditions. For example, in a recent article at the Harvard Business Review, it discussed the various things that employees asked for improvements in their work environment. And one of the top things that employees asked for was natural lighting. Natural lighting. Now, if you've worked in a cave before, you know that actually natural lighting is a huge difference maker in your mood. But that struck me as pretty interesting because, well, first of all, it's remarkable that we even have to ask to see the sun, right? Speaking of inhuman environments, the fact that an employer would have to be told, we'd like sunlight, is remarkable in and of itself. But the other thing that was remarkable in the article is after they said employees want natural lighting, they gave a justification for providing that natural lighting. What do you suppose that was? This is written for employers. Why should employers provide that natural lighting? Everybody knows. It increases productivity. Okay? Isn't that remarkable? Why should you have to justify providing natural lighting? But actually, you all knew this. You knew the justification. And I knew, even before I got to that part of the article, I knew that's where it was going. Why? Because technique is so deeply embedded in our society. Efficiency is how we justify things. I would actually argue that it's one of the last shared values that we have as a society. We all agree that everything should be efficient. And in some ways, I suspect that an employee reading this would actually feel a bit of comfort, a little bit of decreased guilt in going to their employer and saying, I would like some natural sunlight, because they can say, I'm doing this for the good of the company. This is actually efficient. But technique's promise that life is getting easier than ever turns out to be another source of dread and shame. Because look, if life doesn't have to be this hard, if there are answers and methods and practices that can solve all my problems, then really it's my fault that I'm overwhelmed or a failure. If I'm not living to my potential, I'm to blame for not taking advantage of all the different methods and strategies that are available to us. So, why all this suffering? What if at the core of this is a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be a human being? We've created a society, I believe, based on the assumption that we are our own and we belong to ourselves. But if that anthropology is fundamentally wrong, if that's not fundamentally what it means to be a human, then we should expect people to suffer in their malformed habitat. And that's precisely what we discover. The difference between us and the bears is that we are more successful at treating our zoochosis and adapting to our environment. We don't mind so much the pacing back and forth endlessly, especially if we can listen to a podcast while we do so. But we're still sick. Every society is designed with a conception of what it means to be a human being. We design our laws, our buildings, our cities, our practices, our moral norms, our cultural works, our art, our music, our markets, our entertainment, politics, technology, schools, even our churches, based on what we conceive of as a human being. What does it mean to be a human? Is there such a thing? What is the point of being human? One way of the existentialist philosopher Sartre, his great modern claim is that there is no such thing as a human nature. One way of understanding that idea is that each of us is individually responsible, and that responsibility is the key here of creating or discovering our lives. Each of us is individually responsible to create or discover who we are. Now, as we shall see, society helps us meet these responsibilities, but in doing so, it only adds greater burdens. Now, remember back to those bears. Like the Baylor bears, our habitat was intentionally designed for us. Like the bears, it was designed by experts. Like the bears, it was designed for our flourishing, our dream world, right? Like the bears, our world is progressively improved. Like the bears, it was designed with a very specific idea of what it means to be a human. A flawed conception, because remember, they assumed that a bear was the kind of animal that could be kept in captivity. On the one hand, they knew this was not the case. On the other hand, they stubbornly insisted that with enough improvements, enough techniques, whatever maladies and sicknesses cropped up in the bears could be addressed. So they used enrichment activities. In doing research for this was one of the things that I found incredibly fascinating. The way zoochosis is treated in captive animals is two primary ways. One is enrichment activities, and the second is antidepressants. And when I heard that, I was like, wait a minute, that's me. That's how, when I'm endlessly pacing in circles, society says that's what I need. Distract me with some entertainment and give me antidepressants. Again, antidepressants have their proper use, so does entertainment. But it's remarkable that that's how we address these things, instead of asking the question, what's wrong beneath the surface? Because those bears kept pacing. Our society actually goes a step further than what Baylor does. It makes a promise that Baylor can't make to the bears. It tells us that you can be happy and flourish in your habitat if you do certain things. If you accept your anthropology, if you accept that you belong to yourself and you take that responsibility on yourself and you work hard enough, society will give you the tools to be successful. However, the tools that society ends up giving us make us more addicted, stressed, and overwhelmed. Think about social media as an example. Now, for those of you who are Christian in this room, you might be thinking, Mr. Noble, I'm sorry, I don't believe that I belong to myself. My identity is in Christ. You're preaching to the wrong audience. And I would just say, first of all, please, my father was Mr. Noble. Call me doctor. Second of all, ideas are insidious. They're sneaky. Bad ideas worm their way into our hearts like the snake in the garden. My point is that if you hear this and that this idea that we are our own, that we're taught that we are our own and belong to ourselves, and you imagine that this is some secular idea for people out there, outside of the church, I think you're mistaken. I think it is in our hearts. I think it's part of the air that we breathe. Where does this come from? From nearly every corner of our lives, from teachers, pastors, parents, movies, songs, you've been given a promise. The promise goes something like this. You are the author of your story. You are the only one who can define your identity, your purpose, and your values. This is your life. Other people can give you advice. They can model for you how to live well, how to have the good life. They can post images on Instagram of what it looks like to be happily married, or to have a great job, or exciting and enviable adventures with your friends, or to have really holy, quiet time with God each morning. But they can't tell you how to live your life. To be a human is to have the radical and exciting duty of discovering meaning for yourself. Now, if you were at all skeptical of this message, I want to share to you one way that I've seen this express itself in the world. Recently, I was driving to Dallas, and I saw a billboard, and if you've driven to Dallas recently, you've seen this. And the billboard said, and I quote, "Be the main character, Mint Dental." If you're confused, don't worry, I was too. Be the main character. The general idea, though, is simple. It's very simple. And here's a quote from a youth magazine describing what this main character idea is. They say over half of young consumers think of themselves as the main character of their lives. In the last 2 years, the concept of being the main character of one's life has become very popular in social media. This is a quote. But many young people are taking this idea to heart. In fact, 55% of 13 to 39-year-olds. What kind of a demographic is 13 to 39-year-olds? Anyway, that massive group tells us that they think of themselves as the main character of their life. When given the definition, being the main character of your life is thinking of yourself as the protagonist, actively taking control of your life and trying to focus more on yourself and making your wants and desires first and foremost. So main character energy, that's the phrase here, is an example of how this message that we belong to ourselves permeates our society. Here's another example. In her recent NYU commencement speech, Taylor Swift said, "I know it can be really overwhelming figuring out who to be and when and who you are now and how to act in order to get where you want to go. I have some good news for you. It's totally up to you. I also have some terrifying news. It's totally up to you." And as we'll see, it really is terrifying. And part of the terror is that it's not optional. So the promise is, if you accept the responsibilities of belonging to yourself, and you strive to be the best version of yourself, then you will be well-adjusted, fulfilled, rewarded, happy, and successful. That's Swift's good news. What do I mean by the responsibilities of belonging to yourself? Well, if we are our own and belong to ourselves, then there are at least 5 major aspects of our lives that we bear on our shoulders: justification, identity, meaning, value, and belonging. And each of these has profound implications on our lives. For example, you have to decide what justifies your life, what makes your life worth living, what gives you purpose and direction. You've heard all these things before. As you can imagine, the responsibilities of self-belonging will lead us to feel exhausted and overwhelmed, burned out, inadequate, uncertain. That's the terrifying part of Swift's message. This has many implications, but the overall issue is that our lives become projects or journeys or quests in which we and we alone are responsible for fulfilling and making our lives worthwhile. To respond to this, most of us fall into 2 tendencies: affirmation or resignation, which we'll maybe talk about a bit more in a moment. Affirmation is the general embrace of contemporary anthropology, the promise of society and its structure. It's someone who says, yes, I am my own, I do belong to myself, I can fulfill the responsibilities of self-belonging. Society does give me everything I need to live a full and satisfying life. And I can do my part. I just need to find the right techniques, the right methods, have the right inner willpower, and things will turn out well for me. Resignation is someone who says, this anthropology is true. Yes, I do belong to myself, but that sucks. I am my own, and I cannot bear belonging to myself. Society has not given me what I need to compete. I do not have the physical, economic, social, emotional, or mental capital to live a full and satisfying life, so I'm not going to try. Instead, I'm going to find ways of seeking pleasure, of nurturing my bitterness, of tearing down society, of escaping or numbing the pain, or of destroying myself because things can't turn out well for me. Most of us actually oscillate between these 2. And there are social groups, products, movies, music, clothing and narratives for each of these. In the end, in the second session, we'll talk about a truer, better, more beautiful anthropology. The idea that we actually belong to God. The idea that to be a human being is to belong to one who knows us and grounds our being in the world in an embrace of love. But before we do that, I want to talk about at least one of these 5 areas of responsibility: identity. Identity, I think is probably the most significant for us today. We could talk about all five, but we couldn't because there's not enough time. So we'll talk about identity. I suspect that most Christians who would readily tell you that they find their identity in Christ still spend an inordinate amount of time, energy, and anxiety trying to discover who they are and express it to the world. That they, like almost everyone else, feel that their identity is tenuous, uncertain, indefinite, vague, that it lacks substance, that it needs constant vigilant expression and reinvention in Instagram posts and new clothes to be real and meaningful. In other words, we feel like our identities are liquid. Everyone's identity feels liquid, shifting under their feet. And the only way to feel like you know who you are is to express yourself loudly and constantly and in more detail. If you go too long between social media posts, you may feel like you're disappearing. You know, I don't know how many of you remember Back to the Future, but when Marty McFly goes back to the past and he starts changing his family's history, he's got a photograph of his family, and his siblings start to slowly disappear from the photograph as he changes history. I think that's what our identities feel like if we're not constantly expressing. They're just slowly fading away. Maybe you feel this, and maybe you don't. But I do think this Back to the Future image is instructive. Our identity grounds us and orients us in the world, but it's also very contested, insecure, tenuous, evolving, and always open for renovations. Again, identities are liquid. And we are frantically trying to turn this liquid into a solid as it slips through our fingers. Another image I like to use is that of a warehouse, an endless warehouse, an infinite warehouse. Now, the sole purpose of this warehouse is to announce yourself, to say who you are, to say your name. Once you've done that, once you've successfully been heard, somebody has recognized your name, then you're free to leave the warehouse. The problem is the warehouse is filled with people shouting their names, desperate to be heard. And then the question is, who's listening if everyone is shouting? And why does their opinion matter? How do we know when someone has heard us? How many people and how clearly do they need to hear our names for them to identify us, for our identities to be secure? These are real-world problems for contemporary people. Now, society will help you meet this particular responsibility of self-belonging. Society has created an expanding number of techniques, of technologies and methods of publicly defining and expressing your identity. Think of social media. How each platform adapts, how it introduces new ways of posting content to share yourself with the world. It's not a coincidence that it's highly profitable for corporations if people feel uncertain about their identities. It drives us to spend ridiculous amounts of time online, ridiculous amounts of money on clothing and cars and so on. The point is, society recognizes that we need to each be our own person and to define ourselves, and it gives us the tools that claim to help us accomplish this. But guess what? They don't. They only leave us feeling more inadequate, more insecure. They make us addicted. In fact, they introduce us to a greater sense of competition. Remember that image of the warehouse. You're hyper aware that everyone is shouting their name. And it's not just social media and young people. People who aren't on social media have other tools of self-expression to ground themselves. I suppose middle-aged people are more likely to buy a car or a house or have an affair or strut around in the gym. It used to be the case that young people would walk in the mall in order to be seen, because to be seen is to be real. The way they dressed, the shopping bags they carried, the way they walked and who they walked with, all of that was a way of projecting a fractured and uncertain identity out into the world. So while social media is the easiest place to see this anxiety with identity, it's not the only place. One reason that we can't actually build an identity for ourselves if we belong to ourselves is that identity requires a witness, someone out there who can see us. This is built into the definition of identity. You can't have an identity if there's only one being in existence. You have to have a witness. There's got to be somebody over there who can identify us. And that puts us in a very ridiculous position where on the one hand, we'll loudly proclaim to the world that no one can judge us, no one can define us or put us in a box, but we absolutely need the affirmation of other people to feel like we are alive, even if that affirmation takes the rather pathetic form of likes, follows, and shares. As I said, these techniques or methods for creating your identity, they always end up reminding us of our inadequacy because everyone else has these same tools. And there are a lot of people who are more attractive, who are better at doing the things that you do. Everyone is trying to do the same thing. Everyone is trying to feel known and alive and affirmed, to have their identity certain and improved. So we're all competing for the same attention, the same likes, the same affirmation, the same eyes and love and desire. And guess what? No matter how good you are, somebody is better. Somebody's more attractive. It turns out the internet reminds us daily a lot of people are better than us, are more worthy of people's attention or desire or affirmation. So what possible chance do you stand? Now, that's just identity. We could talk about justification, meaning, value, and belonging as well, but we don't have time for that. So that gives you a taste of the kind of burdens that we have to carry. We're required to carry these burdens, these responsibilities of self-belonging. Nobody can do it for us. Nobody can give us an identity or a sense of belonging. We have to choose them. And society gives us tools that help us, allegedly, carry these burdens, but those tools make our lives actually harder. Now, I think that there are two ways, and I mentioned them earlier, but I want to go into a bit more detail to end this first session. Two main ways that we deal with this. One is the way of affirmation, and the other is the way of resignation. Some of you here today have been described as high achievers at some point in your life, although you might not be comfortable with that label because you know how inadequate you really are. But it's true that you do set high goals for yourself. You have high standards. When you fail at something, it hurts a lot. You may feel anxious or inadequate or afraid or bitter. But if you're here this morning, you're probably the kind of person who learns from their mistakes. You're always discovering new ways to improve yourself, to grow, to become more efficient, to practice new techniques, to become what we might call the best version of yourself. You excel at your studies or your arts or your parenting or your hobbies or your profession or whatever. You know that your mindset and your actions are the keys to your future, and you work hard to perfect them. Although you're too smart to believe that you can be whatever you want to be or achieve anything, you do see the world as split between those who hustle and go after their dreams and are mostly successful, and those who are self-defeated, who fail and then make excuses. Which means that your challenge in life is to belong to the first group. Now, a subset of this group, of the high achievers, the affirmers, walk around with low-grade anxiety all the time. It gnaws at you. Every successful or beautiful person you meet reminds you of your inadequacy. Every time you try to rest or take a break, you feel guilty, like you're falling behind. You only feel a kind of peace when you exhaust yourself from working. You complain about how little sleep you get, but you wear that suffering as a sign of your seriousness. I said low-grade anxiety, but that's not quite accurate. You may walk around with low-grade anxiety, but there are seasons or episodes when it's more than low-grade. It's a panic attack. It's the inability to get out of bed. It's depression, shame, dread, ennui. Only a few people know how bad you can get, and almost no one outside of that small circle knows that anything is wrong. Your colleagues think that you are highly successful, that you, unlike them, have your life together. But not everyone is a high achiever. Some of you are done. You're done with a whole game of adulthood or life or whatever this mess is. You know that the world is a highly competitive place and you can't compete. The game is rigged and you know it. You've been told your whole life that your whole future is wide open, but you know that's a lie. Your teachers lied to you because telling little kids that they can achieve their dreams improves their scores on state-mandated tests. That's it. It's a convenient, effective, profitable lie. Your managers told you you have a high ceiling because optimistic workers are more productive workers, even though they tend to burn themselves out. And since you can't seriously compete, you may as well take your ball and go home. It's actually a more efficient use of your time to cut your losses. The alternative is what's called the sunk cost fallacy, continuing to invest time and resources into a hopeless cause, your life. Yes, the system works for some people, but what really separates the winners from the losers is how wealthy your family is or whether your parents stay married. You look at the high achievers, the affirmers, and you know that their real achievement was being born to a wealthy family or being born a certain gender or race or with natural beauty or athleticism or intelligence and so on. And since you don't have those advantages, all you have left to do is distract yourself. And society provides you a million ways to distract yourself. Society encourages you to binge watch TV shows, to watch porn, to drink to excess, to play games for hours on end, to endlessly scroll on social media, whatever it takes to not participate in the rigged competition of life. The point is that you know that you'll never be successful and you're done caring. You stop showing up to class or to work or wherever. Every project is either turned in late or done with the absolute minimum of effort. That first group I call the affirming because they look at the promise given by society that we can have a successful life if we just accept that we belong to ourselves, and they affirm that. The second group I call the resigned because they've resigned themselves to the promise, to the idea that the promise is a lie. Yes, they belong to themselves, but no, that doesn't lead to the good life. So far, I've described these two groups as if people belong to one group or the other, but the reality is much messier. For example, it's possible for someone to be affirming in one area of their life, like their careers, but to be utterly resigned when it comes to romance. Or they go through periods of affirmation and resignation. As a professor, I've often seen freshmen come in very affirming, very confident that they can conquer the world, and then once they get a poor grade or their workload overwhelms them or the homesickness, they slip into despair. But of the two, I think resignation has the greater pull on us because the anthropology that shapes our society presents no actual ends for human existence, no purpose, only an increasing number of means. Justifying your existence is not a definitive action that you do once. It's an ongoing process. You're always journeying and never arriving. If you are responsible for meaning in your life, you can never cease the labor of creating and sustaining moments of significance. If you're responsible for defining and expressing your identity, you can never stop expressing, never stop discovering and fine-tuning your identity. Because your personhood is irreducibly complex, there is never an end to your searching. If you are your own, you can never stop evolving, progressing, perfecting yourself through techniques. The perfectibility of human life through rational methods of efficiency is the bedrock of modern public values. If you are your own and belong to yourself, you belong nowhere and everywhere all at once. You will perpetually struggle between your autonomy and the desire to surrender to a large community of belonging. So resignation is the natural posture of people with no ultimate ends to pursue. This is precisely why one of the most common experiences of modern life is fatigue and burnout. It's why one scholar, Alan Einrenberg, identifies inadequacy as the defining feature of modern depression, feelings of inadequacy. He says, becoming ourselves made us nervous, being ourselves makes us depressed. The anxiety of being oneself hides behind the weariness of the self. We experience life as weariness in part because we suffer from the anxiety of being our true self. It's not just that work is a rat race. All of life in the modern world feels like a rat race. Often the only thing that separates the people who affirm their self-belonging from those who are resigned to them is the qualities of the tools they have to cope, their self-medication. Now, we're going to take a little break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about hope. Because and if you don't come back, you're going to be miserable all day. So, but there is hope, and we need to talk about that. I warned you, right? Didn't I?
In this time of desperation, when all we know is doubt and fear, there is only one foundation. We believe, we believe. In this broken generation, when all is dark,
All right, everyone, we are going to get started on session 2. Hello, my friend Cameron. My name is Chris Clark. I'm the worship pastor here at Redemption Church and have just been really enjoying our talk already this morning. Before we invite Dr. Noble to speak on session 2, I did want to highlight one of the books that he had written that Jeff mentioned earlier. This was a book that we went through as a staff a few years back, and it was really just a great conversation piece for us. You will feel poked and prodded, and you'll relate with everything that Alan describes in here with being a distracted culture. And that's a good thing because you have to ask the question, how do we be an effective witness? How do we continue to speak the truth in boldness in such an age that is so distracted? And so this is a fantastic read if you're interested in more of Dr. Noble's work. You can find these books anywhere you buy books online, audiobooks, physical copies, that sort of thing. Did want to remind you as well, we'll put this number back up on the screen for texting questions. Please start texting those questions now. We had a lot of content in those first few minutes. So go ahead and start texting those questions in, and we'll moderate the Q&A as we finish up. So without further ado.
All right. So I wanted to sort of apologize for the first session. It was difficult to sit through, and I acknowledge that. If it's any consolation, it was harder to stand through than it was to sit through. If you made it back, you are my hero, and I'm happy to say that the critique is over. We've seen the disordered anthropology, and now it's time to look at an ordered anthropology. So we can begin with this question. If we don't belong to ourselves, or if belonging to ourselves does not lead to the fulfilled life that society has promised us, then what else is there? To whom do we belong? These questions make all the difference in the world. Since at least the early 20th century, the predominant existential question for those in the West has been, who am I? But the better question is, whose am I? Who is this being to whom I belong? How do I belong to them? And what are the implications of this belonging on my life? Now, historically, the Christian church has answered these questions by looking at the claim that Paul makes in 1 Corinthians 6:19 through 20. Do you not know that your bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have received from God? You are not your own. You were bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. The context of these verses is a larger admonition against prostitution and other forms of sexual immorality. It's interesting to me to think about the fact that Paul, the Apostle Paul, could have given many reasons for Christians to flee sexual immorality. He might have argued that prostitution is almost never consensual, and therefore it's inherently violent and abusive. That's the kind of thing we might say today, rightly say. Or he might have argued that visiting prostitutes will lead to illegitimate children and broken marriages, or that the practice spreads diseases, which is one of the these are these sort of historical arguments against prostitution. He might have argued that it is simply impure or socially unacceptable. He might have even argued that faithfulness in marriage is an important practice in self-discipline and integrity, an argument for virtue. But none of these reasons make it into Paul's letter. Instead, he grounds our sexual morality in our belonging. Isn't that remarkable? What does this tell us? Well, whom we belong to makes all the difference in the world. If we belong to ourselves, then we are radically free, with all the glory and terror that Taylor Swift told us about. This is our modern predicament. Contemporary people tend to think of freedom as a lack of constraints. Well, one way of thinking about this is the difference between freedom from and freedom to. As Christians, we believe that we are free from many things, but ultimately we are free to be in union with Christ. We are free to turn from sin. Whereas modern anthropology doesn't have a to towards which to be free, which is quite a sentence. It cannot agree on a morality or an end or God towards which we aim our freedom. So instead, there is only freedom from. The point here is that if we belong to God, then our experience of belonging in the world has limits that we have not freely chosen. And some of those limits will defy a value system based on efficiency and measurable harm. There's good news and there's hard news about belonging to God. The good news is that you are not pushing up a boulder up a hill for eternity. You're not carrying the weight of your own existence on your shoulders. But there's hard news. The hard news is that belonging to God will limit you. You will have to die to self, and that is particularly difficult for those of us who've grown up in a society that has taught us that we belong to ourselves. In 1563, the theological faculty of Heidelberg University in Germany released a catechism aimed at educating believers about the basics of the Christian faith. And they begin their catechism with this question: what is your only comfort in life and death? And their answer is that I am not my own, but belong with body and soul, both in life and death, to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ. This is a remarkable place to begin, because it begins with a fundamentally existentialist question. What is your only comfort in life and in death? They assume that you're going to feel great discomfort in life, and you're going to need to have some answer for how to deal with that discomfort. A discomfort in life and in death. How does belonging to God bring us comfort? Let's try to go through each of the 5 responsibilities of self-belonging and see how belonging to God gives us comfort in life and in death. Let's start with justification. If you are not your own but belong to Christ, then there is nothing you can or must do to justify your existence. Your existence, which he actively sustains moment by moment, is a good gift from a loving God. And it's all the justification that you need. The whole project of actualizing, of validating, fulfilling, vindicating, establishing, or justifying your life is built on this faulty premise that your existence is something that needs to be justified by you in the first place. Now, this might sound familiar. I spend too much time on Instagram studying self-appointed gurus and life coaches and affirmation experts and so on. And one of the things that you'll repeatedly find is that people who baselessly offer affirmations of your existence. When someone says that our lives don't need to be justified or we don't have to prove ourselves, they usually mean something like, you are special and important just the way you are. Which begs the question, special how? Important to whom? The only possible answer, according to our contemporary anthropology, is you're special because only you are you, or you're important to yourself because you are the only one, you're the only voice that matters. And we find ourselves right back where we started from with the responsibilities of self-belonging. You have purpose because you have purpose. It turns out that you are special just the way you are is a sort of metaphysical way of pulling your existence up by your bootstraps. So I need you to see that what I'm describing when I say that we belong to God is categorically different. When I say that your life doesn't need to be justified, I mean something entirely different. It's not that your life is existentially validated because you choose to see it that way. No, your existence is good and right and significant because a loving God intentionally created you and continues to give you breath. Your life is significant whether you choose to see it that way or not, which is almost the exact opposite of the responsibilities of self-justification. If Christianity is true, then your being in the world is fundamentally good because the Creator made you and sustains you, and you are made in His image. You are existentially justified because your existence is not random. You are intentionally created. You are intentionally sustained. In Christ we live and move and have our being. The only persons who would actually need to justify their existence are those who are not intentionally created by a loving God. To be alive is to have a justified life, a life of purpose. Our desperate efforts to justify our existence is just striving after a state that we're already in. Now, that doesn't mean that we no longer feel the need to justify ourselves. The felt need remains because we live in a world that tells us that we belong to ourselves. Knowing that your life is justified because God made and preserves you does not mean that you will feel that purpose. If I had to guess, I'd say that most Americans in the evangelical church are not much better at accepting that their lives are a gift from God than their secular neighbors. I witness much of the same ambition, the same anxiety, the same fight for validation, the same fear of inadequacy driving people in the church and outside the church and in my own heart. So we're going to see this as a trend today in these different aspects of these responsibilities. So I want you to pay attention to it. Either we carry our cross or we push a boulder up the hill for eternity. But we always carry some load or burden. The difference, as we'll see, is that Christ's load is bearable with the aid of the Holy Spirit, and that is good news. Okay, but so long as the rest of society expects us to push a boulder up the hill for eternity, to bear these responsibilities of self-belonging, it will be difficult to accept God's grace. That's something that we have to accept. We will have to fight to keep from the habit of pushing the boulder because it will feel like the natural thing to do. For example, my students at a Christian university, if you ask them whether God gives them purpose, meaning, and worth, they will immediately yell yes. But in the same conversation, they will break down crying because they are filled with anxiety about choosing the one right career that will finally give their life purpose, meaning, and worth, the things they've already said that God gives them. What's happening? They are experiencing the cross pressures between their cognitive belief and the purpose that God gives them and the self-generated purpose society tells them that they must have. All right, let's talk about identity. If you are not your own but belong to Christ, then the entire modern project of identity formation and expression is a sham. There's no image for you to maintain because you were made in the image of God. There's no identity for you to discover or create because your identity was never actually in question. It felt like it was because we live in a liquid culture where everything is shifting under our feet. But that feeling isn't reality. And there's no need for you to express your identity to make it more solid or to compete in the ever-growing marketplace of images because your personhood doesn't need affirmation from other humans to make it valid. Remember what we talked about when we talked about identity and witness. I told you that all identities require a witness. But once we begin to rely on other people to recognize and affirm our identity, it becomes uncertain, shifting according to the whims of other people. We're dependent upon their perspective, their attitudes and opinions of us. I think this is why most of us roll our eyes whenever we are encouraged to accept ourselves or believe in ourselves or be whoever we want to be. They're empty self-esteem slogans that don't reflect the reality that we need some kind of external affirmation. Self-affirmation doesn't satisfy. We need some kind of witness. If you are your own and belong to Christ, then your personhood is a real creation, objectively sustained by God. And as a creation of God, you have no obligation to create yourself. Your identity is based on God's perfect will, not your own subjective, uncertain will. All your efforts to craft a perfect, marketable image add nothing to your personhood. The reason the opinions of others don't define you isn't because your opinion is the only one that counts, but because you're not reducible to any human efforts of definition. The only being who can fully know you and understand you without reducing you to a stereotype or an idol is God. And he is your witness. He is the witness who embraces you in love. Let's talk about meaning. If we are not our own but belong to Christ, then meaning is not a story that we make up to dramatize our lives. Meaning is part of creation and our experience when we rightly interpret the world, even if only in glimpses we partake of the truth that transcends us. For example, the love that I feel for my family is not merely a feeling, but it's a recognition of the goodness of family, the goodness of each of their individual lives, and the beauty of our intimate community. Family means the earnestness of a handmade Father's Day card from my oldest daughter. It means the way that my son talks fast and gets excited when he's baking banana bread with me. It means the knowledge that when my youngest daughter snuggles with me, she feels safe. She feels as safe as she probably ever will in this world. It means making my wife laugh, to make the stress of life bearable. Each of these truths that give meaning to my particular participation in family has an objective reality grounded in the character and revelation of God in his word and creation. Here's a question. Does it matter? Does it actually matter whether this experience has a reality beyond my emotions? Do I actually lose something significant if my interpretation of family is merely a product of my mind? A lot rests on this. For many modern thinkers, meaning is only something one feels. And if we are our own, that makes sense. Meaning is just something you personally feel. Which is interesting because these same thinkers acknowledge that we have a crisis of meaning. Virtually no one doubts the benefits of meaningfulness, a meaningful job, a meaningful family, meaningful experience, meaningful vacation. People who feel that life is meaningless are drawn to suicide and other self-destructive behaviors. But if all that matters is that you think or feel that your life has meaning, society can just discover ways of increasing those feelings, even if it means lying to you. One of my favorite thinkers, Jacques Ellul, I judge scholars based on their names, and Jacques Ellul is a great name, right? So he believes that this is precisely what society does. In order to retain productivity, which we've talked about earlier, the modern worker, quote, must be made to feel a community of interests. The idea that his labor has social meaning must be instilled in him. So what's important is the feeling, the idea, not reality. For many modern thinkers, the crisis of meaning raises the question, what methods, what techniques, what tricks can we use to make people feel that their lives are meaningful? And the answers are almost always the same. Give them community, be vulnerable, connect with nature, find a job that gives you agency, take care of your health, and so on. But I don't know about you, but I find that depressing and phony. If you tell me that my interpretation of family is only something that I feel in my head, that it doesn't reflect the truth about reality, it's just the result of personality and chemical reactions in my brain and evolutionary drives and so on, I'm not going to handle it well. I might punch you. There's just something soul-killing about that idea. If I am not my own but belong to Christ, then the meaning I experience in life has an objective existence when it rightly reflects the truth about God and creation and my neighbor. So, for example, the safety my daughter feels when she snuggles with me reflects the transcendent truth that God himself cares for her. And if I'm too busy playing on my phone to realize the significance of her sigh of contentment as she pulls my arm around her, that moment still speaks of the nature of reality. God willing, I will pay attention, choosing to be present in the moment and thanking God for the wisdom that it provides, that moment provides. But even if I don't, there's still something fundamentally good about that experience. And if you can replicate that feeling with a drug or with emotional or psychological manipulation, I'd rather feel nothing at all. Either my experience of meaning reflects in some shadowy way the real reality of existence in the world, or I, of all people, am most to be pitied. Let's talk about values. If we are not our own but belong to Christ, then the values that give shape to our culture and our personal lives rightly put limits on us. We talked earlier about technique, and I gave the argument that efficiency is one of the last shared values in our society. We can't really agree on sexual morality, but we can agree that everything ought to be as efficient as possible. Well, the Christian alternative to technique, which is that obsession with efficiency, is what I would call prodigality, which requires us to be faithful, to depend on God for your future. What do I mean by this? Well, we live prodigally when we act according to love or goodness or beauty rather than primarily efficiency. So, for example, the overflowing cup which God gives David in the 23rd Psalm is prodigal. I don't know if you've thought about this image before, but strictly speaking, you don't need a cup to overflow. Usually it's actually a bad thing if your cup overflows. It creates a mess. It's excessive. It's prodigal. It's wasteful from a secular perspective. The expensive ointment that Mary uses to anoint the feet of Jesus, that's also prodigal. As Judas observes in John 12, a more efficient use of the ointment would be to alleviate poverty. Our very lives are prodigal, by the way. God did not need to create you, but he did, and it was good. Now, this isn't to say that we should be inefficient for the sake of being inefficient. That would be foolish. Prodigality simply means a way of being in the world that takes for granted God's existence, his goodness, his providence, which frees us from those responsibilities of self-belonging so we can joyfully be present. It's prodigal because from a contemporary secular perspective, it appears to be wasteful. You're not primarily focused on whether or not you're winning or benefiting or progressing through the actions. So, for example, maybe you sit on the porch and read to your child, and maybe that's been proven, scientifically proven, in many studies to improve their vocabulary by 5 points. I made that up, but that sounds entirely plausible. But to read prodigally or leisurely to your child is to read with them on the porch because it's a lovely day, and you love your kid, and it's a good book. And it may be that gardening has been proven to reduce stress and help the environment. But you garden prodigally when you enjoy the feel of the earth in your hands and the taste of fresh tomatoes and the beauty of a well-designed flower garden. There's a lovely example of this in C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, where Screwtape admonishes his understudy demon, Wormwood, for letting his human patient enjoy reading a book and taking a walk. According to the demon, allowing a human to enjoy such things for their own sake is dangerous. It's the kind of act that might bring the human closer to faith in God. Screwtape laments, "This is where you went horribly wrong. You should have put it into his mind that he had to get up in the morning and take a walk for the sake of exercise. It would have become drudgery to him. And you should have gotten him to read the book so that he could quote it to somebody else. It would have become equally uninspiring. You allowed him to enjoy such pure pleasures that the enemy's voice has become more audible within those experiences. That is where you went wrong." In each of these experiences, taking a walk and reading a good book, the fear that Screwtape has is that the human will act prodigally and see God's grace in that. Again, some of these things have measurable benefits: gardening, reading, taking a walk. But to act prodigally is to make a decision based on love, goodness, and beauty rather than primarily efficiency or productivity or profit. Let's talk about belonging. Well, one more comment. If we are our own, we need to justify everything we do. If the modern anthropology is correct and we are our own, we need to justify everything that we do. We need to know that we are optimizing and competing and improving all the time. And that's the pressure society puts on us. But if we are not our own and belong to God, things can just be good, and that's enough. All right, let's talk about belonging before God. If we are not our own but belong to Christ, then we are not free to belong wherever and to whomever we choose. We have limits and obligations. But we can also never be lost. No matter how uncertain and disorienting and alienating the world may become, we can never be lost. A defining feature of our moment in history is that we have tremendous freedom to choose where we belong. Another one of my favorite thinkers, Zygmunt Bauman, because he's got a great name, Zygmunt Bauman, describes this feature of our contemporary time as until further noticeness. He says that a lot of our relationships have an until further noticeness quality to them. So I'm your spouse until further notice. I'm your good friend until further notice. I'm your parent until further notice. Our belonging is tenuous. But if we belong to Christ, then that's not true. Our most significant commitments are not ones that we choose, but ones that are given to us: church, family, and place. For example, no one chooses where they will be born or to whom they will be born or their family history. They are given to us. And children are given to us. We are given to each other. These basic natural familial bonds place obligations on us regardless of our preferences. Now, that's not to say that you should put up with abuse or blindly submit to your family's will for your life. Please don't hear that. The particular way your obligations to family play out will depend on your circumstances and the specific shape of your relationships. But that you have obligations to your family, that you belong to them in some basic way, is not a choice. It's a fact about the world. And that feels very strange to modern people. The same could be said and should be said, must be said about the body of Christ. To follow Christ is to acknowledge that you belong to him and that he died for your sins, and that requires accepting the obligation of belonging to a local church. And if you have been in church long enough, you know that that commitment is not an easy cross to bear, because there are people in church, and you know what people are like. People disappoint. It's much easier to cut and run when belonging to a church is unpleasant or painful or uncomfortable. While belonging to a church, at some point you're going to be hurt by somebody, just like belonging to a family. You'll have to learn to love people who look different than you, who have different interests, passions, languages. You'll have to learn to give sacrificially to support people who in a strict meritocracy don't deserve your compassion or aid. You'll have to submit to the right leadership of elders. You'll have to get over yourself and get out of your head. And most hardest of all, you'll have to do all of this while rejecting the lie that it is your love and your service that makes you righteous or important or justified. You are righteous because Christ is righteous. You love and serve because he loved and served you. To a lesser extent, but I think it's worth mentioning, we belong to where we live. Our contemporary anthropology tends to make us think of our surroundings as tools for self-development or improvement. So I move someplace and I stay in someplace if it's advantageous to me. But if we are our own, then the natural world and even the architecture of the city are valuable. If we are our own, then the natural world and the architecture of the city are valuable only if I can use them to get ahead. So, for example, it might be advantageous for me to care about the natural world so that the polar ice caps don't melt and send Florida into the ocean. But I don't fundamentally owe creation anything. But if the Christian account of the human person is correct, where I am matters. By dwelling in a place, I am forming a relationship with it, one with bonds and obligations. And I don't have the freedom to alienate or separate myself from the physical environment any more than it has the freedom to deny me. I'm not saying that there's something inherently wrong with moving for work, for example, or to be closer to family. All I'm saying is if we belong to Christ, our default ought to be that we see ourselves committed to our families, our friends, our communities, where we are, and the church. And this is where we belong, even when it's difficult. So, to conclude, what is this great comfort in life and in death that comes from belonging to Christ? The great comfort found in belonging to Christ is that we are accepted and loved without reservation. It is the comfort of living before God. That love is not the ignorant love of a human who can never really know us. That acceptance is not the cheap acceptance of modern social psychology, which is only really concerned with producing productive and well-adjusted consumers. Christ truly knows us, and his acceptance unites us to him, sanctifying us by teaching us moment by moment to love what is true and good and beautiful, to love his will. Modern life is weary, and we're all heavy laden. When we accept and embrace our belonging to Christ, that inhuman burden is no longer ours to bear. Our sins are forgiven, and the inhuman demands of our society are exposed in all their hollowness. Because we still live in a habitat made by humans but not for humans, we will sin. We will forget or deny that we are forgiven, and will slip back into shouldering those responsibilities of self-belonging again and again. In those times, our task is to remind ourselves what we know to be objectively true. We are not our own, but belong to Christ. For myself, the greatest comfort in belonging to Christ is that the things that are most central to my experience of life find their home: love, beauty, justice, joy, guilt, pleasure, longing, sorrow, delight. It is these things, not in the abstract, but in particular moments and with particular people, that give life most of its grandeur. I know I can find alternative frameworks to explain the love I feel towards my wife, or the pleasure I experience in reading a great novel, or the righteous indignation that fills me when I witness an injustice. But none of those accounts can avoid impoverishing the very things I find most true about life. In Christ, I take comfort that the truest things in life are the realest things in life. There is comfort in death through belonging to Christ, but it is a hard comfort because it asks us to stand before God every moment, never denouncing or rejecting the gift of life, but taking each opportunity to delight in God, enjoy his creation, and extend his grace to others so long as we physically can. This is true even when we suffer physically and mentally, even as we lose control over our bodies and must depend more and more on others. We can be comforted that before God there is no burden to use our life efficiently to accomplish enough or achieve enough or do enough with our limited time to justify our lives. We are comforted that the unimaginable prospect of annihilation is unimaginable precisely because it is not true. And when we stand before God, we have the comfort of knowing that he will see his Son and he will say, "Well done, good and faithful servant," which is all we really wanted to hear anyway. Now, I want to end on a note of rest. We all need rest. If we are our own and belong to God, we have the freedom to rest. We do not have to hold up the world or even ourselves, which is good, because the responsibilities of self-belonging are unbearable. Rightly practiced, a Christian anthropology should create people who are known for their ability to rest. And I'm not talking about an efficient recharging so that we can be more productive on Monday, or the conspicuous fun of travel and entertainment that you see on social media, nor the frantic relaxation that requires us to consume all the right content. Have you seen this show? Have you seen this movie? Have you listened to this album? So that we don't experience the fear of missing out. And I'm also not talking about vegging, where you give up in hopeless exhaustion and incapacity. Biblical rest is something different. It's possible because we don't need to act to save the world or to justify ourselves. Because a loving God created and preserves the world because he has promised good to all who love him. We don't have to feel guilty for not being productive at all of the time or not using our leisure in the most efficient way. Rest without anxiety or fear of falling behind or missing out is not only possible for us because we are not our own, it is required of us. Biblical rest is prodigal. To me, I think the two most moving verses in all of Scripture are in Luke 10:41 and 42, when Martha comes to complain about her sister Mary, who isn't helping serve a meal to Jesus. It says, "The Lord answered her, 'Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion which will not be taken away from her.'" Now, I've had this conversation with my children several times, and my impulse is to side with Martha. I share Martha's habit of being anxious and troubled about a great many things. But Christ's words cut me to the quick. "Martha, Martha." By speaking her name twice, I think Christ draws Martha out of herself and out of her fear that if she didn't take care of everything, the world would fall apart, or at least her corner of the world. I imagine the first time she hears her name, Martha pays attention to Christ. But perhaps her mind is still racing with all the things that need to be done, all the preparation that needs to be accomplished. Martha was physically present with Christ, but spiritually, all she wanted from him was for him to order Mary to help. With the second mention of her name, I imagine that Martha's defenses broke down. Christ spoke to the Martha behind the Martha who believed that she was personally responsible for everything. The essence of his response is that there is only one thing ultimately necessary: delighting in Christ. Necessary is a heavy word. It carries a sense of urgency and action. I'm sure that Martha was convinced that serving in precisely the right way was necessary, just as we have a long list of necessary things that we must get done before we can rest each day. Perhaps Lazarus stopped her in the kitchen and said, "Why don't you join Mary at the feet of Jesus?" And Martha may have replied, "I just need to finish this, and then I can. Because there's always just one more, I just need to." Jesus subverts Martha's conception of what is necessary. The one thing doesn't require Martha to act. Isn't that remarkable? Martha doesn't have to do anything, or at least not the usual way we think of acting. This is an action in stillness. All that's necessary is to rest at the feet of Christ and delight in him. I think we are a people of Marthas, chronically unable to cease our work and to delight in Christ, because we have been told over and over that we belong to ourselves, and we are obligated to create lives of meaning on our own. So we feel safer when we have exhausted ourselves laboring for our own justification. And the sight of Marys, those people who can rest, they tend to make us bitter. But it doesn't have to be this way. By God's grace, as we continue to understand that we are not our own, we can learn to rest. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to call to order now. If everybody could find their seat. We'll get going with our session 3. Again, we want to welcome you. We're glad you're here. We're glad that you spent your morning with us. I'm Audra Swindell, and I am the Minister of Equipping and Women here at Redemption Church. And so I'm going to kind of have just a conversation here with Dr. Noble and with Jeff. And you guys have sent in some questions. We're going to just throw them at them. I haven't prepped them. We're just going to throw it out there and see how this goes, okay? So as you're hearing, if it spurs more, I'm kind of using your questions all as a pool. I may not be able to get to every one, but know that we did receive it. And if it's something that we don't address and you'd like to talk more about, you can always talk to us afterwards about that, okay? So first off, Dr. Noble, and I think Jeff as well, can you talk some more about the various anti-human techniques? And there's another similar question about AI, as in like, kind of the things we're all used to would be like automated checkouts for groceries, call centers, that kind of thing. But also, as a professor, I know this new, what's it called, chat? Yeah, yeah, that's it. So, could you talk about kind of how do you think that comes to bear on this conversation?
So the way technology develops is that we develop things, and then afterwards we figure out the mess that we've made and deal with the consequences. And I certainly think that's what we're dealing with. We can build it, so we'll build it, and then afterward we'll realize the consequences. We're experiencing that with social media, certainly. I think maybe TikTok in particular, the effect it's having on young people. Somebody created these algorithms, these systems that feed people certain ideas, and then afterwards we realize the effect it's having, and then we have to deal with it. So part of what we need human design in our technology and in our techniques. We need human design where we're designing for the good of humans. And the good of humans, what's difficult about this is it doesn't mean giving people what they want, because very often we want things that are very toxic to us. And so we have to actually design things that are for the good of people, whether they recognize that good or not. One thing I would say is I'm not a technological determinist, so although I do believe that we create technology and then afterward we figure out what we've made, I think we have the choice to not make things. People intentionally decide to create things, and so we can intentionally decide not to. Jacques Ellul argues that we must choose not to do all that we can do. And I think that's a really good posture, to choosing not to do all that we can do, choosing not to adopt all the things that we could adopt, choosing not to buy all the things that we could buy, choosing not to be all the things that we could be. That is a particularly modern, he wrote about this in an essay called The Ethics of Non-Power. It's a passive way of resisting a certain kind of culture. So, I don't know if that answers the question, but those are some ideas you want to.
I think I've got them on
you've got
here.
your
So
own.
yeah,
Do you want to?
they don't trust me with those. I'm not good with
Okay.
them. So they don't like, you can't hold things. You're not capable. I think there's a lot of ways you can answer that question. Have you seen the movie The Social Network?
I
You
have not.
familiar with that one? How many of you all seen Social Network? I feel like it's a brilliant film. The screenwriter is the same guy that did West Wing. He did Newsroom. He's done all kinds of stuff. And the thing about that movie that I thought was brilliant, it's about the founding of Facebook. Although it's not really about the founding of Facebook, although that's sort of the storyline. But what it unveils is that all the main characters in the story have kind of an identity seeking, that they're looking for affirmation. They're looking for something. They're chasing these kind of idols of their heart, these things that they want. For the kind of Olympic athletes, it's if we do everything right, if we train hard, if we're smarter, if we do the thing, we're going to be rewarded. And when they're not, they get really disrupted. The other guy that is, I'm going to be smarter, and I've got the well-being of kind of building a financial career, and I've got this expertise that I bring. And when he gets shelved, he gets really frustrated. And then the other guys just want to be cool, and I want to fit in. The other guy wants to be at the forefront, at the buzz. And as you watch the movie play out, there's just this amazing kind of transfer of each of these guys pursuing something, and they're all using this technology to get it. And I think that's the thing that we do. We come to technology with whatever is broken in here, and we bring all of that, and technology just magnifies it. And so throughout the course of the movie, you just see each of their lives get derailed by the way that they're chasing after this thing and hoping that somehow this technology is going to allow them to achieve it. And then there's this haunting scene at the end. I'm going to totally give it away, but if you haven't watched it by now, that's on you. But the kind of end of the movie is Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, and he's sitting alone at a computer, and he's gone back to this woman, this girl that he liked, this woman that he liked, had a relationship with early in the movie, and they had a breakup. And he's sitting there looking at his Facebook page, hitting refresh, hoping that she's going to accept his friend request. And it's just this gutting scene of the emptiness of, if I pursue and chase these things trying to fill a need in me, that there's just an emptiness at the end of the day. And I think that, for me, when I think about the inhumanity of the world, like all these things are just they're tools, but if we try to meet a need that these things are not intended to meet, we're just going to end up hitting refresh, trying to fill our tank with something that doesn't really fill it.
Okay, good, thanks. All right, kind of shifting gears, would you say, Dr. Noble, are there cultures or eras that had a more authentic anthropology than the one in which we find ourselves? Is this false anthropology specifically Western, American, or even modern?
Yeah, so my theory, I'm not a historian, so here's my theory. My theory is that every culture has, and every period has had some disordered anthropology in some way. The question is, in what particular way it's been disordered. I think what I've described is a particularly Western, very American anthropology. But what I don't want to do is say, well, you know, the Middle Ages really had it right, or something like that, right? I mean, that's simply not the case. So no, I don't think that there's some ideal era that we could go back to that would fix some things, but I'm confident that there would be other errors. So I'm very hesitant to judge, to weigh in the balances different periods of time, because I feel like those scales don't exist. Like how do you balance, these sorts of things? How do you balance, for example, the horrors of the 20th century with the horrors of the Middle Ages? What is that? What kind of scale do you balance the Holocaust and the Crusades, right? And the plague, and it just. So, in my opinion, our task is to figure out what are the particular maladies of our time, what are the roots of those maladies, what can we do about them? We should not be surprised that they are different from the past, but also we should not be surprised that they come from the past. So that's my answer.
Jeff, anything you'd add?
I think that's probably good. I think C.S. Lewis sometimes talks about it's helpful to go look at previous generations, not because they were better or smarter than we are, but because they just saw things differently. So I think there can be a benefit to going back and looking at some historical stuff, because it enlightens us about the way we see our things. They just looked at the world through a different lens. So sometimes I think that helps us see the errors that we're bringing in ways that talking to one another, if we're both looking through the same lens, we're all three swimming in the same water, so we're going to tend to see things in the same colors. But if you go back and look at someone else, all of a sudden you go, I wouldn't have thought about that from that perspective. And so I think it can be helpful to look back, but I don't know that I wouldn't put it in a better than, worse than category. I'd put it in a different time.
Yeah, okay. So there's a lot of talk right now about institutions. And as Americans, a lot of times we can be current Americans, we can be kind of anti-institutional. Do you see institutions as helping or hindering this false anthropology we have?
I'll go first. Yes. Alan?
Yeah, no, I think I concur. Yeah, I mean, so many institutions, and you can think about the example I gave with the lighting, contribute to this. So they'll feed this idea that we belong to ourselves, and they'll use that actually to abuse us for their own ends. However, that doesn't mean that institutions by design are anti-human. That actually we need good institutions. We need to be committing to institutions that allow us to flourish and promote human flourishing. We need to be creating and sustaining them, because those will be pockets of resistance in a culture that has a toxic anthropology. But right now, you'll have institutions, many institutions will ask you to fully commit, to fully belong to them, but they won't belong back to you, right? They want to use you for their ends. So we need organic organizations that are actually pursuing good human ends, which means leadership that chooses to not be as efficient as possible, which is a very difficult thing to do in our highly competitive era because everyone wants to be as efficient as possible, to be as winning as possible. But what we need to be is as human as possible, because that's honoring to God, to design institutions in ways that are humane. So that means, giving people lighting. Even if a study comes out that says actually natural lighting slows people down. You give people natural lighting, all of a sudden they get sleepy, they want to take a nap, they're not as productive. You still give them natural lighting. Yeah, they're looking at squirrels, they're looking outside the window, right? So you're not in bondage to whatever the latest research says about productivity.
Okay, how would not being your own apply to providing for your family? So do we work to put food on the table and provide shelter, or is that something that God provides? And if it is God, why do we work and try to make a profit and increase our earnings or even save?
Yeah, don't work. Just done. Next question. God uses us to accomplish his means in the world. And one of those things that we do is we serve each other. So ultimately, all good gifts come from God. So when we put food on the table, that is God providing for us. But he's providing through us. And so we serve each other. We serve our families, we serve our neighbors, we serve the local church, and we do that dependent upon God, which means that there's always a sense of humility. So even when we are able to achieve great things to bless others, we always know that that is an act, a gift from God, not of our own efforts, even though he worked through our own efforts. The Christian faith is paradoxical. We're called to work with excellence, but we are dependent upon that excellence upon God, and we give glory to God for that excellence. We work with excellence, but that excellence doesn't define or justify us. To the world, this can be difficult to understand, I think, but that's the tension that we have to live in. That's what I would say.
Okay, that kind of leads into another question, and there's several that are all around this certain kind of thought, and I'd like for you to speak into this too, Jeff, is kind of, is there a question I can ask myself to see if I'm serving and loving and living in goodness because I find value in Christ, because I understand my right placement, the way you've talked about it, and then this kind of as the other side of this, the Christian version of efficiency, kind of like the Mary Martha. Is there a question I can ask myself to like really reorient myself? Which way am I operating out of?
Jeff, do you want to speak into this?
Sure, I'll start. You've had to go for a while. I'll try to jump in here. I think it's really hard, and I think at any moment we're all mixed. The fact of the matter is, we're up here doing our best to try to give you something good today. But we, even in the middle of this moment, we both have our own junk mixed into the pot. And so, we're talking to you, and we're nervous about sounding the right way and saying the right things and being helpful to you and being perceived the right way and not saying something in this culture that would get us labeled as something we're not. And you think about all those things. And so my own stuff's all mixed into that at the same time that I think we have a very godly intention that God has given us to use the gifts which he's given us to communicate and teach in order to help you and serve you. And I think the reality of our existence is we've got broken hearts, and because of that, they're mixed. John Owen talks about that our heart is infected with weeds and things that have overtaken it, and we have to clear that away. And part of that spiritual growth or sanctification process is learning to clear our own beings of all the stuff that's there that isn't helpful, that actually impedes growth and flourishing. And we have to go clear that. And frankly, sometimes John Owen says you come to a tree that's so large you can't do anything about it, and you just go around it and leave it for a time until maybe you can come back around to that. But you start clearing all the stuff that you can clear. And so I would say, as you think about where you are, I think that's part of that relationship with God, is that you're walking with Him day by day, moment by moment, and you have to trust His grace right now and right now and right now, because you need it. It's like breath, and you have to trust it all the time. And so as you're serving, I think you do the best you can to sort of clear the slate and say, okay, Lord, I want to be available to you, and I want to serve, or I want to do this thing for the right reasons and not be compulsive. And I think there are those questions you can ask, like, am I finding myself be compulsive? Am I finding myself being driven? Am I finding myself running past people to get to the check at the end of the box, or to be able to check the box off? And so I think there are tools and things you can do. I think there's also a reality that we're going to live in the tension of kind of being in between, kind of this side of heaven.
Yeah, so maybe instead of a question that you can ask to reveal, maybe you can just ask God to reveal. Like, maybe that's what you need to do. Just say, God, show me where I am living unto myself and for myself, and show me how to belong to you and to those you have put into my life to serve. Because that prayer is always going to be honored by God. It might be painful. Sometimes when we pray things and, when God gives us what we ask, it's, not immediately pleasant, but it's good, right? So I think that's what I would say, yeah.
So don't you think that means that maybe even a first step would just be recognizing that even as Christians doing good things, that insidious, deceptive thing is there?
Absolutely.
Right? I mean,
yeah.
like, a lot of times we're not doing crazy stuff that's bad, that looks bad. Like, sometimes we're doing good things. So just that kind of it could be insidious. It can be, like, deceptive that we don't even know.
That's good, Audra.
Let's see.
So while you're thinking through the question, I just had another thought as you were talking. So I think there is a posture. I think another way to come at that is not necessarily a question, but maybe having a posture of teachability before the Lord that allows Him to instruct you and the Spirit to speak, that works in kind of highlighting where those things are for you. And I think you do learn in some ways. One of the languages we use on our staff is, lights on your dashboard. That sometimes you see things in your world that would be like a little light flashing on the dashboard of your life that says, hey, you may be missing it right now. Hey, you may not be totally aware right now. And I had one of those this week, just to give an example of Chris. We finished up our last Sunday at Cheyenne Middle School where we met. We're now meeting here. We're about to move downtown. And Chris sent a picture that night of kind of turning out the lights and the last time he was there. And I got that picture and I thought, wow, I didn't think about it. Like, I was already just on to the next day and the task and getting here and doing the thing and doing whatever. And what I realized in that moment was, like, I'm just running. Like, I was pushing to the next thing so fast that I ran past the moment to some degree. And I think there are ways you can posture yourself to kind of be self-aware and allow the Lord to kind of highlight some of those things for you.
I have a question. This is specifically for Jeff. Do you think the church can be helped by operating more prodigally, especially since we often hear business language in Christian circles and churches?
Oh, man. How long we got? I think the difficulty is, it's funny. Can I just be honest? I mean, it's probably good. We haven't been honest before, but as I seek to continue to be honest, when you come, like, this is our first time ever to do an event in this space right here. And it's impossible in our world to come into this space and not go, well, what's the lighting? And what's it going to look like in video? And how's the thing going to work? And what's the deal going to be? And can people get up and down the stairs? And, like, we have all these things that you immediately start looking at. And even as we're sitting here, we're like, oh, we need to get some alternate chairs. We need to think about, and you start chasing down all these things we have to do because it's the world we live in. And in some ways, we have to have a space, and we have to use it. We have to do those things. And so there is this pressure to fit in and to perform well and to make everything look slick and right and good and appealing, and that you want people to come and you want to do these things, and yet at the same time, you really just want to serve people and teach them the truth and help them understand who Jesus was and what it looks like to walk with him and to live for him. And so there's always that difficulty. I think there is there's a tension we're going to live in, and part of that is, part of what I appreciate about what you said today is these are the waters we all swim in, and we'd be foolish to think they didn't influence us. And we could put on kind of a hyper-spiritual thing and go, oh, we're above this, and we're not influenced by all these things. But the reality is the people we're trying to reach, you all, come into this building, and you're influenced by all those things. And the people that are trying to offer these things, we ourselves are all influenced by these things. And so there's a tug-of-war, and I think we do have to fight to remember how to live prodigally in that. And it's funny, Chris and I sometimes will talk about even our worship service, like how do we create more space just to live in that space? And but everyone's going to want to be out on time too. So there's just those are the tensions we live in our world. And I don't know if that answers the question, but I think we do have to fight. And maybe I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. How do we create pockets and spaces, and how do we breathe kind of prodigality into the rhythms of our normal, whether they're rituals or liturgies, or James K. Smith talks about, we all have a liturgy we have to lean into. So what are the patterns and the liturgies that we create and lean into in order to foster those within the life of our church? And some of those need to directly resist the temptation to chase and to run and to do and to choose the messy and to choose the slow and to choose the relational. And it's efficient to make everything about 1 hour a week on stage, because you can put 4 people on stage that are really talented and call it church. But that's not what the New Testament and what disciples of Christ look like. It's messier to do what Jesus did and say, well, I called these men up to be with me because I desired to be with them. And he walked with them for 3 years and was in the mess of their lives. And somehow we've got to foster those kinds of environments and relationships.
Yeah. So actually, as you're talking, it reminds me of something that Chris Clark has taught me, which is like kind of where our affections are placed as we're doing things excellently. Like we want excellence in our worship, right? We want people who are doing things well, but are we doing it because we want you to think we're entertaining you well? Or is it because we believe the Lord has given us every single thing that we have and we want to live out of that goodness of God, right? And so that kind of undergirding, I think it's a lot of what Dr. Noble has talked about, is like, where are our affections placed? Who are we seeking to promote, right, at the end of the day? Okay, we've gotten several questions, and I'm going to kind of try to boil them down into one. How does belonging to Christ change how we parent our kids? And maybe there's I've gotten questions from people who I know who have younger children, and so it's kind of building those first things foundationally with them, and then some with older children who might even be in college, and so they're feeling they're believers who know this but are feeling that cross tension, like you mentioned.
I feel like that's a book, which I won't write. Parenting is so hard. When they see us modeling the way we belong to each other, belonging to them, belonging to our spouse, belonging to our extended family, belonging to our neighbors, belonging to a local church, I think that is very powerful, especially when they're young. But even as they get older and they understand the sacrifices that you are making, I think that is a powerful witness to them, because they're going to have other models of pursuing life as an adventure, as a quest for the self. They'll see that everywhere else and be told that and sold that everywhere else. So if they can see you doing something else, that will be a powerful witness to them. As they grow older and as they start making life decisions and choices, helping them see that the purpose of those choices is not to become a fulfilled individual, but to serve others, I think is part of what, through pursuing excellence in what God has given you, that is a way, I think, of tangibly helping older kids to see belonging to God. I don't know, you're a parent. What do you do?
It's a good question. Dan, you want to come up? I think there's so much, and that is a book. That's something we could talk about forever. I think one of the things I see, particularly in Christian parents, is one of the ways I think some of this stuff insidiously kind of sneaks into our world is we want to try to control the outcome of our kids. And so we're afraid that they're going to get off the rails. We're afraid they're going to explore in the wrong ways. We're afraid they're going to try things. And the parenting process, the whole point of it is to release kids to go be healthy, flourishing people in the world. And so those are counterproductive to try to micromanage and control. And so we focus on that efficiency, that productivity, that how do I make them do all the right things and get all the right and go down all the right paths. And I think one of the things we have to remind ourselves is, and I've done this with different groups of leaders where I've looked and said, did any of you have a drink of alcohol before you turned 21? Did any one of you see, any kind of pornography before you got married? Did any of you, and you could go through this list and almost everyone looks around and is like, oh, yeah, I did. Well, your kids are probably going to do those things too, just FYI. And I know we don't want to think that those things are going to happen, but somehow we've got to release them to, and I think part of that is helping them learn grace, allowing them to fail, allowing them to make mistakes, and then being present and loving, and being the loving presence of, to the best of our ability, the presence of Christ and a loving Heavenly Father to them in the midst of those things, so that when they launch out into the world and they trip and they fall down and they aren't productive and they run after affirmation and realize it doesn't meet their need, and then they run to resignation and they have to get built back up, that they've begun to learn how to trust the Lord because they've begun to learn that they can trust you. And so I think for me, those are allowing them to make some mistakes and to breathe and begin to do that as they get a little older. From little age, you just don't run in the street. But as they get older, you've got to begin to release them and allow them to learn how to kind of stand on their own and walk with the Lord. And then the only other thing I would add for that is say you're sorry a lot and admit that, man, I messed up too. And here's the way I'm wrestling with this thing right now. I think those things are helpful.
Yeah, so I want to also give a plug because that was about 1% of the really good things that Nay and Lawrence talked about last Sunday.
It's pretty much how our marriage works.
Yeah.
I bring the
Jeff
1%, man gives you the other stuff.
You said it, not me. So if you want to see that conversation, it's now online on our equipping page from our website, redemptionokc.com. So I would encourage you to go listen to that because a lot of what she talks about is very grounded in this conversation today. We're kind of needing to wrap up, and so kind of last, I wondered, Dr. Noble, if you would tell us, give us a little plug on your next book that's coming out on getting out of bed.
Sure, yeah. So April 18th, my third book on getting out of bed. It's about the beauty and, I don't know the subtitle, the beauty and burden of living, I think, something like that.
The burden and gift of living. Burden and gift of living.
Oh, good, thank you. Yes, the burden and gift of living. Yeah. Subtitles. It's a book about mental health. It's a book about mental health. Getting out of bed is a figure representing the choice to live each day, which sort of the premise of the book is that everyone at some point or another is going to be struggling with mental illness or mental health or mental affliction of some kind because life is very difficult. And at the core, although there are lots of ways to receive help today, which is wonderful, each of us has to answer the question, why get out of bed? Why continue to exist despite suffering? Which sounds like a morbid question, but it's a very real question. And I think if we don't have an answer for that now, when you go through a time of suffering, you're not going to be in a good place to be able to address that question because you'll be in a bad place. So it's a book about that. It's not a memoir. It's not a self-help book. It's like a letter from a friend who cares. So I don't know.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'm going to turn it over to Chris to close it down for us.
Awesome. Can we please thank Dr. Noble for being here? I just want to say a thank you on behalf of Redemption Church, on behalf of Dr. Noble. These city conversations are something that's been lingering in our hearts for years, and so we're just so excited to get to launch these. So thank you for being here. Thank you, Pastor Jeff, for us and helping us to have this conversation. So from here, can I give you just like a really human thing to go do? You're probably hungry. Why don't you go grab a bite with somebody? Why don't you go find somebody in the room that you want to continue this conversation with? There's several amazing new restaurants in downtown Edmond that you could go sit and have a quick lunch and just discuss, keep this conversation going. If you can't do that today, maybe think about a person you can text or invite to lunch or coffee later on this week. And just to continue this conversation. If you're anything like me, my wheels are turning, my heart's churning. I'm like, man, this is really good stuff, and I want to go deeper. So that's a really human thing that you can go do right now. And then lastly, if you don't have a church home, we just want to say you are invited. We're going to be right here in this space tomorrow. Redemption Church will gather here for the next few months. Our gatherings start at 10:30 a.m. We have fantastic childcare, children's church programming, and then also our student ministry will be gathering here as well. So if you don't have a church home, you're invited. I think that's it for us. Can we give one more hand to Dr. Noble? Thank you all for being here.